May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, it is time for your pastor to make a confession. It is a confession that weighs heavily on me a bit. I have to admit and come clean with the fact that I had written a pre-written sermon for this week. And by pre-written, I mean it was a sermon that I gave before in another context that I was just going to repurpose for this week. I'd preached this sermon somewhere else, and the reading was the same, so I thought, because I was out earlier this week with my husband celebrating our anniversary, that I'd just use the sermon I already had instead of writing a completely new one. No preacher has ever done this before. And I will say it was a good sermon, or at least I thought it was. It was all about our first reading and how God shows up in the unexpected places. Because if you remember that first reading, Elijah's on the mountain and there's the fire and the earthquake and the wind. And everyone expects God to appear in the fire or the earthquake or the wind. But instead, God showed up to Elijah in the most non-traditional place expected, the silence. Think of our first hymn for today that we just sang, God of Tempest, God of Whirlwind. It was all images of God in fire, in earth, in wind. It never once mentions the silence. But God came in that place no one God expected, and the need for us and the lesson for us is when we look towards leaders of the church to understand that a non-traditional leader might offer just as much, if not more, than the traditional choice, and that God can be active in those non-traditional choices. Because it would be traditional for God to show up in the fire or the wind. What was the third one? Or the earthquake. Sorry. It would be traditional for God to show up there, but God shows up in the silence. So too, we expect God to show up in certain types of leaders, usually white, straight men. If we went by tradition, I would not be a leader in this church because being gay is not traditionally something that is allowed in church leaders. If we went by tradition, someone like our former pastor, Pastor Mary Konopka, would have never been a leader in the church because we all know women can't preach. If we went by tradition, our bishop, Patricia Davenport, would not be a pastor or a bishop because she is both a woman and a woman of color. And the ELCA has only been ordaining women of color for 40 years now. If the church looked toward its traditional leaders, the expected places God would show up, then none of these other great leaders would have ever gotten to use their gifts for the glory of God. We must look towards the non-traditional sometimes to find those great leaders in the church because God is doing work in the non-traditional places. And I thought it was a good sermon, but I realized I needed to take that message a bit further. Because that sermon was written for an ordination, to be heard by new leaders and other pastors and leaders of the church. But I am now preaching here at Redemption, a very different context. And that message needs a little more nuance and pointing, especially in light of our gospel for today. Because today we get another of Jesus' greatest hits. Jesus just fed the 5,000, and now we're going on to Jesus walking on water. Jesus is just taking a leisurely stroll through the storm after he has been alone to pray on the mountain. And he's going on the water towards the disciples, and once the disciples recognize it's Christ, because at first they are terrified, thinking it's a ghost, it is Peter who calls out to Christ and says, "If you command it, I will get out of this boat and I will walk towards you, Jesus." And Christ says to Peter, "Come." And for a while, Peter does pretty well. He gets his footing under him and he steps out. But then when the storm picks up around him, when that storm surges, Peter loses faith and begins to sink. And it is Christ who is there to catch him. Now, what does all this reading have to do with our congregation here in this place? Well, at the risk of sounding like Uncle Sam, your congregation needs you. Redemption needs you. We are all in the midst of a storm right now, individually, family-wise, congregationally, in the world. We are in a storm. And we don't know exactly where we will end up. We don't know exactly what the church will look like on the other side of this. We are being tossed about, and there's only so much we can do in this moment, in this tossing. But as we come out of the storm, as we assess the damage, as we look toward what the future will look like for redemption, we will need volunteers and leaders. Redemption will need help. And it's all of you, that will have to do that work. And I know the immediate thoughts when you hear that is, it's either I already helped long ago, so I don't need to help again, or that job, or that position, or that role, or that post, well, it just isn't for me. The thing is, we need Peters right now to take a step off the boat. We need people who may not traditionally be thought of in a certain role to take on those roles. We need your gifts, your talents, your input, and your labor as we seek to continue to reach out to this community with the Word and the love of God. We need to start stepping out of the boat now, because remember when Peter stepped out of the boat towards Christ, it was still storming when he stepped out. It was not yet calm. Peter took that leap of faith during a time of stress and difficulty. And it will be scary when that person or volunteer comes and asks you, do you want to be on church council? Or do you want to help with this committee? Or do you want to participate in this project? Or are you going to join us in this visioning session? But remember, the disciples didn't recognize Christ when he first showed up. They thought it was a ghost and they were scared. And when you hear that offer, you might immediately think, this isn't a part or a role for me. I'm scared of that. I don't have time for that. But after Peter got over that initial fear and saw it was Christ who was calling to him, and when you look at that person who's asking you to take on this role, and you see they're asking not just for themselves, but for God and for Christ and for Christ's church, then you can step out on faith like Peter did. You can step out of the boat in faith. And that faith won't remove the fear or the struggle. It certainly didn't for Peter. It didn't make it easy. And Peter did stumble, but God was there to catch him, and God will be there to catch you as you venture into this new thing. God will be there to catch all of us as we navigate through the new realities we're going to be called into and these new roles that we might fulfill. What we are experiencing right now with this pandemic, with the ever-evolving nature of the changes in our lives, will be a hinge point in redemption's history and the history of the church as a whole. God is calling to us through the storm, each and every one of us, and I encourage you to have faith and to step out of the boat. And I know it might seem like you aren't the traditional choice for the job, but we all know I'm not the traditional choice for this job, and here I am. God has done amazing things through all people, and especially through someone who didn't expect to take on a role. So when you get that next offer to help redemption or to help your community, don't immediately poo-poo it. Take time to think, to pray, and to take that step into uncharted waters. And you won't know exactly where it will go, but you will know you've got a community here that will support and love you, and that God's loving arms are ready and there to catch you when you feel like you're sinking. You can do this. Step out of the boat. Amen.